Hello, I'm Tamara Copeland, President of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers. RAG, as we shorthand our name, is a collective of foundations and corporate giving programs in Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland, and the District of Columbia. In 2015, a group of philanthropic leaders came together under the RAG umbrella to talk about how they might address the racial unrest that was affecting our country. They decided to heed the words of John Gardner, the founder of the independent sector and Common Cause. He said, "The first step in leadership is not action, it's understanding." We are embarking upon a learning journey. We've entitled it, Putting Racism on the Table. Over the course of 6 months, we will explore the following topics: structural racism, white privilege, implicit bias, mass incarceration, the racial mosaic of America, and then look at how philanthropy is addressing racism across the country. As you're watching this video, we know that you are joining this learning journey with us. We hope that you will use the discussion guide that we have developed as you gather with your colleagues. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We will not remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." I'm delighted that we are no longer silent.
I want to talk a little bit about demographic change nationally, and I want to bring it down to the metro area and the city of DC, which I think are actually quite different, and along the way tell a few stories and tales. So the demographic change in the United States has been pretty dramatic, and it's one of the reasons why the pot is being stirred in a way that's led to the Donald Trump phenomena, which is really an appeal to a combination of racial anxiety and economic anxiety at the same time. A country that's different than a country in the past, and a country where the economic place of people is remarkably uncertain. But you can see that this shows you change for the country as a whole in the 80s, 90s, and aughts, that in the aughts, 2000 to 2010, nationwide, the growth rate for Latinos was 43%, the growth rate for Asian Pacific Islanders was 43%, for African Americans, 11%, for non-Hispanic whites, only 1%. So, for example, when the president won re-election in 2012 with only 50, even though he had no more than about 40% of the white vote, you found all these commentators, they were just so surprised, and they were slapping their foreheads and going, "The country's changed, the country's changed." Demographers like me were going, "Where were you for the last couple of years?" This data was there. So what's interesting about this change, and we'll get to a little bit more detail in a second, is that when most people think of the demographic change, and you can see it in the rhetoric of this year's election season, they think that what's driving that demographic change is immigration. And that's what drove it in the past, but it's no longer what's driving it. In fact, immigration into the country slowed down. Most demographers and economists are worried that we're not going to have enough immigrant workers in the future. Immigration from Asia is now outpacing immigration from Latin America. And perhaps most significantly and interestingly, immigration from our largest sending country, Mexico, is now a net negative. There are more Mexicans returning to Mexico than coming to the United States, which means if we build a wall, we're just penning Mexicans in. So now, that is not a phenomena that's likely to change. And the reason why is not just the relative performance of the Mexican and US economies. Mexico's doing better than it was in the past. And it's not just enhanced border security, which has had an impact. Although not what most people think. The enhanced border security has meant that when people cross the border, they now stay, so that now more than 60% of undocumented people in the United States have been here for longer than 10 years. right? Because it's so costly to return or go back and forth. What's driving that is fertility. Fertility in Mexico has declined from about 5 children per woman over the course of their lifetime. That was 35, 40 years ago. Now that fertility rate in Mexico is 2.3. In the United States, it's about 1.7, 1.8. As a result, as those two come together, really what's driving demographic change is kids being born here. See that in a second. What does that look like in the metro area? Metro area, that's interesting. This is the Washington metro area, so parts of Virginia and Maryland as well. You can see that still sizable growth in the African American population for the metro area. And you had very big growth in the Latino and Asian Pacific Islander population. And for the last decade, that's coming off not as small a base as in the past, so it's actually sizable and important growth. But this is what the city of DC looks like. The city of DC has been losing African Americans for decades now, and it's accelerated. And in particular, what's fascinating is that in the last decade, 2000 through 2010, there was a 32% increase in the number of non-Hispanic whites, even as the number of African Americans was on the decline. That's the gentrification of the city of DC, the transformation of the city of DC, which is now still nearly majority African American, but transforming dramatically. What does that look like nationwide? Nationwide in the aughts compared to the 80s. So in the 80s, about 36% of population growth in the United States was from non-Hispanic whites. In the aughts, only about 8% of population growth was from non-Hispanic whites. About 56% of the population growth in the United States came from the Latino population. This is what it looks like in the metro area for DC, or Metro DC. You can see in the 80s that the growth in the metro area for non-Hispanic whites and people of color, pretty much the same. When you move to the 90s, big growth in the people of color population, much smaller growth in the white population. In the metro area in the aughts, healthier growth in the white population, significant growth in the people of color population. So that's where most of the metro growth is coming from. But this is what the city of DC looks like. And the thing to take a look at here is the aughts. In the aughts, 2000 through 2010, big growth in the white population, big decline in the black population. Where's that then demographic growth occurring? In the suburbs of DC. So that's a phenomena that's actually a national phenomenon. We'll talk a little bit more about it, which is the suburbanization of people of color, of immigrants, and also of poor populations. So what's that look like going forward? This is the demographics of the United States going forward. It's predicted by the year 2043, 2044, the US will be so-called majority minority, or as I like to think of it, all minority all the time. So all of us will be a minority group. So that's by 2043, 2044. What's fascinating to someone like me, economist by training, demographer by hobby in a way, because really what could be more exciting than being a demographer? And what could be more entertaining than demographic facts? And I will tell you a few demographic facts later that are, if you know them, are sure to get people to flock to you at a cocktail party, to bring you martinis with olives, and ask you if you want another immediately. So by 2043, the country's majority people of color, interestingly, 11 years before that, 2032, the majority of the workforce is people of color. Now, I didn't say the majority of entrants into the workforce. That's already true. Young people, immigrants. What I meant was the majority of the workforce. Why? The white population is older, retiring, the majority of the workforce. So if we're thinking about the economy of the future, we've got to think through these demographic changes. By the year 2019, majority people of color for the youth population, and already the majority of third graders are kids of color. What does that look like in the metro area? We'll see the projections in just a second. We don't have them for DC, but we do have the history, and you can see here what happened in the metro area. Basically the share of African Americans stayed pretty much the same. Share of whites went down. Growth in the Latino and Asian population, that's the metro. Look at the metro going forward. If you look forward, you're going to see that the continuing growth will be in the Latino population and the Asian population according to census projections. Just a little bit of a decline in the African American population in the metro area as a share. But for DC itself, you can see that what's happened for DC is that the share of the population that's African American has shrunk consistently since the 1980s. Big shrinkage between 2000 and 2010, continuing to shrink as we move forward. That's something that's been of great concern to folks in the region. Again, what is driving us? It's no longer immigration, it's the youth population. And what this shows you is the change in the youth population between 2000 and 2010. So for whites, the number of young whites actually fell by 4.3 million. And I always like to reassure people at this point that that does not mean that 4.3 million young white people died. That we would have noticed that. What that means is there's more people becoming 19 and 20 than becoming 1 and 2. So number of young African Americans actually fell by 250,000. Some of that's redesignation into the multiracial category, but less than most people think. The Latino population grew by young people 4.8 million, the Asian Pacific Islander by 800,000. So that's the next America. That's the next America. That's the child population that we're looking at. What does that look like in the metro area? In the metro area of DC, more growth than in the rest of the country. In the Latino and API population, some decline in the youth African American population. What that means is that when we've historically in some locations, DC being one, a place like Pittsburgh, etc., thought of race and black-white dynamics, those are no longer the only dynamics that are there. And it's also not only a dynamic of white people of color, because there's important dynamics between groups of color as they are the groups that are often in the closest proximity, trying to figure out what their relationships are, etc. We could talk a little bit more about that. We're doing a lot of work in, South Los Angeles on these kinds of issues. So the other part of this, as I mentioned, is the suburbanization of the people of color population. So this is the DC metro area, and you can see here the grayish dots are non-Hispanic whites, the sort of greenish dots are African Americans, sort of yellow is Latino, red Asian Pacific Islander. You have a small Native American population. That's what it looked like in 1980. You'll note that the people of color population concentrated in the city and a lot of gray dots in the suburbs. This is what you look like in 2010. Big shift into the suburbs, including of the API population and the Latino population. Big changes. And this is what you look like metro-wise in terms of a breakdown. So let me say a couple of things before turning to maps, because there's always one interesting question that comes up in particular at this point, and it has to do with the relationship between or Latinos and race, which is, I think, a useful thing to understand. Because, you know, what's interesting is that the way the census collects these statistics, right, is they ask race, and then they ask Hispanic, non-Hispanic, right? And so people are always curious, maybe you are too, how do Latinos, you know, deal with this issue? And it's interesting, you know, the census did not collect data on Latinos until 1973, and the first time they asked the question on the census was 1980. Now, that does not mean that Latinos did not exist. I know. I was one, right? So, I mean, nobody asked me, but I was there, right? So in 1980, it's the first year that they collect data on Latinos. And they asked two questions. They first asked people, what race are you? Are you white, black, Native American, Asian, or other? And then they asked, are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic? And it turned out, 1980, they get back the results. They're a little bit frustrated because it turns out that about 35% of Latinos marked other. They didn't mark a race. And so the census said, well, it was the first year we did it. Maybe the Latinos were confused. So they ran the questions again the same way the next year in 1990. What race are you? White, black, Asian, Native American, other, and then are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic? And that year, more Latinos marked other. 40% marked other. So the census said, geez, what's going on here? And so they went and investigated the individual answers to the census. You could actually see what people, after they mark something, what they write down. So a lot of people who marked other Latinos would then write something like, Chicano! with like 3 exclamation points, literally, right? And you're like, yo, bro, I get it, man, you proud, right? So, but mark something. So they said, you know what the thing is the Latinos need to get it out of their system, right? So they flipped the questions in 2000. They asked first, are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic, right? And then they asked, what race are you? Thinking, okay, now they're going to let us know they're white, right? And that year, more Latinos than ever marked other. So the last census, there was this really interesting thing because those marking other went down. And people say, well, why? Well, it turns out if you look at the census, what they did was they changed the question the last time. Now, it's still the same question, basically. Are you Hispanic or non-Hispanic? And then it says in bold, Hispanic is not a race, right? And then when it gets to the race question, it says, Hispanic is not a race, right? And despite being told not to do it, 45% of Latinos marked other, right? So what's part of what's going on, and this, I think, is this kind of rejection of the black-white binary on the part of Latinos. And that's going to have some pretty profound impacts for the way we think about race in the United States. Is that interesting? So one other story about this, which I think is really fascinating, because it gets at something people also don't quite understand. I did a paper a couple of years ago with a colleague, which had a great title. Titles are always important. And the title was, Where in the World is Juan? And what color does he think he is, right? So we wanted to take a look at whether or not when Latinos marked white or other in the census, was their location in a suburb? Did that make a difference? Like when you moved to a suburb, did it just make you feel whiter, you know? And in order to do that, we had to control for everything else that might impact that, like how wealthy you were, right, or what country you were from, and things like that. So it turned out that, yes, suburbs whiten, which, by the way, was really what suburbs were meant to do. I mean, if you think about the post-war suburbs, they took people who were German and Italian and Jewish and Slavic, and they made them white, right? They made them into a single white suburban, separate from the city, which was black, right? I'm overdrawing this, but you get the point of what the suburban location was supposed to do, which is why it's so profound that suburbs are changing right now. And I'll get to that in a second. So we looked at this, but then one thing we looked at that was kind of surprising to people was there's a thing in the literature where most people think that basically what happens is Latinos, when they first arrive into the country, are sort of confused about the racial categories. And so that as they spend more time in the country, they're going to figure out that they're white, right, Italian, or they're going to mark black, or they're going to basically figure out the racial categories of the United States. That's what most researchers thought. Here's what we found out. The more time you're in the United States, the more likely you are to mark other. There's something about being here that just knocks the whiteness right out of you, right? So, And I think that that's a really significant thing. I mean, part of what's going on for the Latino population is sort of what is the identity going to be? Is it going to be an identity that's a people of color identity that will be linked with African Americans and Asians and have that kind of an identity? Or is it an identity of assimilation and disappearance? And what the evidence suggests is that there's a lot of possibilities there to retain that identity in some interesting ways. So the demographic change is occurring all over the country. This is a map from a project we're doing with PolicyLink, 1980. Here, the darker the shade of the county, the higher the percent people of color. And you can see that the United States in 1980 looked like what a lot of people still think it looks like. The Black Belt of the South heading up to DC, the borderlands of Mexico with Texas, the Native American and Hispanic areas of New Mexico and Arizona, and then some of the Native American areas in the Dakotas. You could see that California in 1980 only had one county that was the majority people of color, and that was Imperial County in the border with Mexico. This is what the country looked like in 2010. I'm going to do that again. And what you can see is that a lot of demographic change, but where did most of it seem to occur? California. And that's led to a really interesting thing, which is that when people think then about demographic change, they think, well, okay, we're going to become majority people of color, but it's all going to happen in California, right? California is going to become 150% Latino, right? They're going to be sort of super Latinos marching the earth going, Aslanike, we're back. But really what's going on is that the demographic change in California is going to slow down. And in fact, here's a really interesting demographic tidbit. The only large metro area of the 100 largest metro areas in the United States that did not see an increase in the number of Hispanic children in the last decade, Los Angeles. Because we're sort of at the end of a demographic process. Our Latino population is more homegrown. Our immigrants have been there for a longer time. The fertility and patterns are getting closer to that of the United States. What's going on is that the change is going to happen all over the rest of the country. Diversity is coming to a theater near you. And in unusual places. So for example, a place I never thought of, Salt Lake City. I don't know what you think or thought of Salt Lake, but when I think of Salt Lake, I think not just white, but shiny white, right? Just Book of Mormon white, right? So, but it turns out that Salt Lake, which was about 95% non-Hispanic white in 1970, will become majority people of color slightly before the rest of the country. Huge influx of immigrants from Latin America and from Africa into the region, some Asians. So big changes that are going on all over the country. And another dynamic of those changes is the shift to the suburbs. It's the suburbs that are experiencing the most rapid increase in diversity. They're also experiencing the biggest increase in poverty and concentrated poverty, not something that they're used to. So this is the DC region in 1980, and then in 2010. Now the reason why this is important is because when we often think of philanthropic work around race or poverty, our thoughts get driven to the city. And yet the places, and believe me, I'm not saying abandon the city and its work, but think about these changes in places that have essentially very limited social services infrastructure. They weren't built for it. Very limited civic infrastructure, because people often move to suburbs to escape civic life and political engagement, and also very limited organizing infrastructure, which is how communities get their issues on the table. And if there's no organizing infrastructure, it's hard for them to get their issues on the table. So one of the things I think it's important for people who are thinking about philanthropic work and philanthropic work around race, equity, et cetera, is to think about suburbs and what that means in suburbs as well. So question. Yeah.
One of the things that I've been hearing a lot about is that the 2020 census is going to be all done through the internet, and that this is going to have a huge impact on communities of color because they will, the census takers will not be going out to the neighborhoods, and the undercount will even be higher than it's been in previous censuses. What do you think about that?
That is so likely to occur, it's ridiculous. So it's absolutely the case. They're trying to do this through the internet. They already have a pretty significant undercount on the ACS. So the American, the census was mandatory and perceived as being mandatory. The American Community Survey, which is now is perceived as supposed to be mandatory, but it's perceived as voluntary. I have a feeling that's going to rub off on the 2020 census as well. And then also the method in which they're collecting it is going to have a significant drop-off for people without an internet connection and for people who will be continue to be scared of the government in terms of their documentation status and a number of other things as well. And increasingly, because so many households are mixed status households, they won't report the household at all because they're worried about the one or two individuals who are undocumented in the household. So these, I think, are going to be very big issues. The other thing that's been problematic has been the refusal of, for reasons that are make sense politically, the refusal of Republicans to allow for the adjustments in the count that would reflect the undercount. So we know there's an undercount. We can estimate how large the undercount is. We should be able to adjust the census to reflect that, but that's considered too much good social science to allow it to take place. And it's going to result in it's going to be a real challenge because the 2020 census is it's beyond important. And if there's one thing, if you want to put money into the community-based organizations that are going to work to get people counted in the census. The 2020 census is going like the 2010 census coupled with the 2010 midterm elections set the political terrain for a decade, right? That count coupled with a Tea Party wave and a shift in state legislatures led to a gerrymandering such that we've got a Congress in which the party that dominates by a large majority, in fact, did not get a majority of the votes in the country because of the way the districts are drawn. In 2020, we've got both a census count and we've got a presidential election, and which tends to bring more young and minority voters to the fore. That's going to be determinative of the next decade of politics. So the 2020 census, which will be the information on which redistricting will take place, will be incredibly important. The undercount is certainly an issue. Yeah.
When you refer to Black, does that include Africans? We have a very large African population in this area, and I know on other census materials that's not broken out, but in fact, the reality of life for those two segments are very different.
But yeah, one of the things that people don't realize is how significant the immigrant share is of Black people in the United States. And so that then it's particularly important in some regions, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Washington, D.C., New York, and in fact Los Angeles as well, where about 10% of Blacks are actually immigrants. So it's a really important thing to kind of break down. And I don't have it here, but you'll see a little bit later in some data where we do break Blacks by immigrants and non-immigrants, which is really significant in particular regions. A lot of this data, by the way, is part of this project that some of you may be familiar with, the National Equity Atlas that we've done with PolicyLink. It's a place where you can go and get all sorts of data. And the newest data is disaggregated data on nativity for Blacks, and then also disaggregated by different country of origin groups for Asians and Latinos in the United States. So all of this is important data. None of it is as interesting to me as this set of statistics. This is the median age by ethnicity for the United States and then for your metro area. So for non-Hispanic whites, the median age, US, 43. That means half older, half younger. For Asian Pacific Islanders, 36. For African Americans, for blacks, 33. For Latinos, 28. So 43, 28, 15 years. It's a generation. It's a generation gap. And it helps to explain two things. It helps to explain our demographic change. Because when you're 28, you're more or less in prime family formation age. When you're 43, you think you're in prime family formation age, right? You may well be, Godspeed. But it also helps to explain our politics. We've got an older generation not seeing itself in a younger generation. And as a result, it winds up not making the investments that are necessary for that generation to move forward and thrive. And that's something that's reflected in our politics. The state that has the biggest generation gap, the whitest old and the brownest young, is Arizona, with its fractious politics around immigration and ethnic studies in the schools, but also in the last 5 years, the third largest cuts in K through 12 spending per student, and the largest decreases in public university spending, new generation arriving, investments being pulled away. And that's kind of a big general problem in the United States as a whole. If you think about that slogan, "Make America Great Again," right? It's about harkening back and protecting an older generation and starving. I mean, if you think about the politics of that too, no cuts in Social Security, no cuts in Medicare, where are the cuts going to come, and all the spending that has to take place for the next generation, particularly if you're going to have tax cuts, that'll be massive, right? So there's real generational issues that are going on. What's fascinating is the DC area. In the DC area, you've got a lot of young white people, and actually the African American population is older than the white population. You've got all these people who are flooding into the DC area to get the jobs locally. So all of this is this demographic change that's occurring. And I want to suggest to you a couple of ways, a couple of things that I think are important in terms of talking about it. And the first is talk about it, right? So I think that there's a tendency to think that we can sort of deal with race by not talking about it. I'm so glad to see these kinds of sessions where people are saying that when we surface these issues, we can actually wind up making sure that we can make a difference on these issues. I also think it's really important to set a tone where people can actually figure out how to talk to each other about it and essentially make mistakes as they learn with each other. You kindly mentioned the book before this book. It was actually 2 books ago. Uncommon Common Ground. That was a book that was written with Angela Glover Blackwell from PolicyLink and Stuart Kuo, who at the time was head of the Asian American Legal Center. They've been rebranded as the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And when we got asked to write this book about race in America, and most people were, wow, that's fascinating. It's an African American and a Latino and an Asian writing a book about race in America. We were like, wow, it's 3 Californians. So we wrote this book, but we realized this thing when we wrote this book is that we'd actually worked together for years, but we hadn't had some of those really tough conversations about race even amongst ourselves. So we sat down for the first 2 days, didn't write, we just talked around issues like, you know, why is Jim Crow still so important to you? Didn't that happen a long time ago, right? Or why are you complaining if you're Asian? Don't they have higher incomes, right? Or Latinos, can't you figure out what to call yourself? Like Hispanic, Chicano, Latino, what is it, you know? And what we realized by having tough conversations with one another, and we had a technical term for that. We called it the days of saying stupid shit to one another, right? Where we could realize that, well, Latinos are finding out what to call themselves because we're coming to who we are in this society. That some Asian median income may indeed be higher, but the poverty rates are as well, because it's a bifurcated community, and Asians feel and are treated like the perpetual other in the society, like integration is not possible. And yes, Jim Crow, slavery were fundamental defining characteristics of the racial order of the United States. They've been remanifested as the new Jim Crow with the system of over-incarceration. They have to be part of the conversation. So creating places where people can have those difficult conversations are important and critical. And they're critical now because of the economic issues. And they're critical in two ways. One is that this shows you the share of income, first going to the top 1%, that's the blue line, then the top 1 to 5% and 5 to 10%. You'll notice from the 1980 on, a big run-up in the share of income going to the top 1%. And that's really the 1% running away from the rest of us. A lot of that has to do with excess CEO pay. In the 1960s, the average CEO made about 20 to 30 times what the average worker in his firm made. Now the average CEO makes about 350 times what the average worker in his or her firm makes. So either they're 15 times more productive or they've gotten 15 times better at getting higher salaries. Probably the latter, actually. So we're seeing a lot of challenges with the top 1%. We're also seeing below that, even for full-time year-round workers, that it's not just the 1% running away with a bunch, it's that those who've got higher education have done well in this economy. Those who have less education are not doing so well. So this is for full-time year-round workers for the United States, the gray bars, and the Washington metro area. The 90th percentile, meaning 10% of workers make more, 90% yes. So we're not talking about the top 1%, but just the extraordinarily favored folks in the labor market. 80th percentile, the median, the 20th percentile, and the 10th percentile. You can see that that's been a gradient like this, where the bottom has slipped, where the top has grown. Interesting, in the Washington, D.C. area, the median has gone up, different than in the rest of the country. But again, the gap between those at the top and those at the bottom have changed dramatically. So there's also been very little racial progress. This shows you the gray going into the black line is the ratio of black income to white income in the United States. And you can see that there's only two periods in which that gap gets kind of closed. The 1960s, civil rights era, and also tremendous economic growth in that period. And then the second period in which the gap gets closed is the Clinton era. That is 92 to 2000, when there was a very tight economy, and that helped facilitate a lot of people getting into the labor market. But aside from that, there's been very little progress on closing the black-white and certainly also the Latino-white income gap, which actually has gotten worse and approached that of the black-white income ratio. This is pronounced in your area. This is Washington, D.C. metro. The percent of families living below 150% of the poverty line. So you can see that you did well relative to the rest of the country, but you've still got 9% non-Hispanic whites living below the poverty line, more than twice that for African Americans, and 3 times that for the Latino population, almost twice that for the API population. In the DC area, higher levels of poverty for everyone, but big racial income gaps as well. This is likely slated to get worse. And the reason why is that if you look at jobs in the United States, jobs in the Washington metro area that in the future are going to require only a high school degree. That's about 30% of the jobs. But only about 16% of white US-born and white immigrant have only a high school degree. About 37% of US-born blacks, about 30% of immigrant blacks. 67% of immigrant Latinos have no more than a high school degree. If you look at jobs that require a BA or better, Washington metro area, it's 45% of the jobs. In the 60s for whites, in the 30s for blacks, either US born or immigrant. For Asians, 76%, for the US born, 63% have a BA. What that means is that the current inequality is slotted to get worse because the jobs that are going to be jobs that require only a BA are going to experience overcrowding from African Americans and Latinos. The jobs that require a BA or better are going to see a lot of competition from whites and Asians and very few African Americans and Latinos with the degrees to be able to get into those jobs. So this is an issue that is going to need to move forward. And I want to tell you a little bit about why this is so important now. So this is my favorite graph. Demographers always think of an age pyramid. Lots of young people, less people middle-aged. When you get to older ages, less and less of us. And it is true that in 1950, we had an age pyramid. Baby boomers, less people in the middle, people passing away. But as we move from 1950 to 2060, the age pyramid is becoming an age cylinder. Less young people being born, less immigrants filling in the middle, and as a result, more people surviving into old age. What does that mean? That means that the next America actually needs to be more productive than the current America, because the so-called dependency ratio, the number of old people that each person, retired people, that each person in the labor force will be supporting, is actually going to increase by 50 to 60% over the next 30 years. So unless the folks coming into the labor market and doing well, unless the folks coming into the labor market acquire the skills to do well, they are not going to be able to make sure that we've got a more productive and sustainable economy moving forward. So this discussion about race is a discussion not just about now, but about the future, about having an honest conversation that can break down the generational gaps, that can make us recognize our common interests, and can make sure that we make the investments that make sure that we'll survive. This is very important because we need to, yes?
All of your information is on income. Is there any information on who controls assets and what's happening? Because assets provide long-term economic security. If income translates into assets, but they're unable to translate into assets because of their...
God, what a great question. The question is, the data I've been presenting are on assets, on income. What about assets? The bad news is that the disparities in terms of assets are much worse than the disparities in terms of income. And part of that is generational persistence. So if your parents have had some money, then you, even as a middle-class person, may have some money moving forward. And so the ratio of, while the ratio of white to black income is, on average, I think it's about 30, 40% higher. But the ratio of white to black median assets is about about 15 to 1. So, and that's for the median group. And there's another aspect of this, which is really particularly for both African Americans and Latinos, net assets are mostly held in terms of their own home, and that got tremendously dinged during the Great Recession. So unlike more whites tend to have, again, generational and historical legacies where there's been more income inherited over time, even for middle-class folks, and as a result have more money in stock markets, financial assets, et cetera. For Latinos and African Americans, it's mostly a question of real estate, and that is a significant, that means that you don't have the cushion to survive tough times. It means that you don't have the assets to borrow to start a business. It means that it's difficult to finance a kid's college. There are real challenges there. Yeah.
Yes, there's obvious reasons to demographically protect Social Security, Medicare, et cetera. Is that going to become even more important as people don't build up net assets?
That's a great question. Is the defense of Social Security and Medicare going to be even more important for people retiring? I mean, I think that that's true. It's interesting because the first question was, what does that mean in terms of social policy? And what I thought about immediately was actually reparations. Because, you know, the real issue is how do you actually, because, you know, unless you've got that's a politically difficult kind of a position to take. And so I think there's some discussion of something called baby bonds, which is to create a system in the United States where everybody who's born simply gets a bit of assets that is kind of theirs, that's held for them until they're 18, then it could be used for college, et cetera. That would kind of level the playing field. I think those kind of things would be good. I think it does behoove the banking system to make sure that finance gets out to these communities that are often unbanked. But the net asset issue is a tremendously difficult political issue, but looked at from strictly an economic point of view, it's something that needs to be addressed. And you're right, from a social policy point of view, more and more people are going to depend on Social Security as kind of a primary way to survive. So we've got this kind of argument about why the next generation needs investment and how to move forward. And the other part of this that I really want to, it's in this new book that you mentioned, Equity, Growth, and Community, is that it turns out that it's also the case that when we invest in equity, we actually grow the economy. Economists have traditionally thought kind of the opposite, that inequality, while it might be morally distasteful or liberals might not like it, actually is good for economic growth. Now, if you think, I mean, just think for a second about that chart where inequality was on a big increase, and what was happening to the economy. It's getting weaker and weaker, right? And in fact, there's new research out from such left-wing, admittedly biased organizations that are looking at the relationship between inequality and economic growth and finding out that, you know, nationwide, or comparing nations, those nations that are more unequal can't sustain growth. Comparing metropolitan areas, Cleveland, which is what the Cleveland Federal Reserve did, that metros that are more unequal, more segregated, bigger city suburbs don't have sustainable growth over time. And that's actually one of the big subjects of our book, Equity, Growth, and Community, in which we actually replicate the International Monetary Fund study for 200 metropolitan areas of the United States and find that inequality is a major Achilles heel. Why? With inequality, you get less consumer demand, we know that. But you also get kind of less a sense of the commons, like that everybody's going to benefit, less investments in public education, more conflict rather than more collaboration around how to grow the economy. So that's what that first chapter was about. I do hope that some of you read it. I hope that more of you buy it and that you stay in tune because it's about to be made into a major motion picture. I have to rush back tonight because we're finishing negotiating the movie rights. I was going to be portrayed by Antonio Banderas. I was very excited about that. It turns out it's George Lopez, but still it is a movie, and I'm quite interested in that. And we can talk a bit about policies, including asset building. What I want to do is end on these three topics in a story. So in the work that you move forward with, and we'll see how this makes sense for you and doesn't. But the admonitions that I would give are four. Three of them here, and then one I'll tell you a story about. So the first is that to stress that equity and inclusion need to be baked in, not tacked on, right? It's not that you think about an economic development strategy for a region and you go, oh, I wonder how we could make it fair, right? It's not that you think about political participation and then worry about the people who are left out. It's that when you make the investments in those communities that are the lowest income, the folks that have been left behind, that can actually generate prosperity for everyone. The second is to be willing, and you clearly are, to tackle issues of race and to understand the new complexities, some of which I touched on with the Latino population, the Asian populations, and the relationships between them. And I think in doing that, to understand something which, again, I'm coming into this process at this point, but from what I heard this morning, is to understand a lot of the structural stuff. I've been saying this a lot recently in some talks. I think it might get me in trouble in some places, but I came to it while I was teaching a graduate course this term, urban sociology, or just understanding urban areas. And you hear this term, the disadvantaged, right? And I kind of realized finally when I was teaching this course that there's a difference between the disadvantaged and the intentionally fucked over, right? So, there's disadvantage, right? I've got a knee injury and I can't run any longer. That's a disadvantage, right? But that's different than a system that systematically over-incarcerates African American men. That's different than a broken immigration system, which means that Latino and Asian kids coming home every day are in fear about whether or not their parents will still be there or they'll have been deported. That's different than a system in which the minimum wage refuses to be adjusted at a national level. That's different than a system in which there's active disenfranchisement of people's votes. That's not a disadvantage. That's a structurally baked in problem that actually needs to be tackled and talked about in a more complex way. And that means that growth and change can be uncomfortable, because when equity gets on the table, it gets on the table often through conflict, and it also gets on the table through some hard discussions. Again, I want to echo something that you were saying earlier, Nat, if you don't mind. You really totally caught my ear, which is that we've had decades now of a lot of Black institutional and Black organizing infrastructure not getting the investments it needs to get the issues on the table. And unless we make those investments, those issues aren't going to be there. And that's incredibly important, primarily because with the Latino and Asian growth increasing, and that's a lot of the dynamism, there's going to be a tendency not to pay attention to African Americans and those issues. And that means it's, by the way, it's something really important, that it's important for me to say that and not just you to say that. Does that make sense? So that's really where I want to end. And I want to end with a story which actually also explains the disadvantaged knee. And it may seem a kind of funny place to end this discussion, but let me try it anyway. When I was in graduate school at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, in the 79 to 84, I started playing basketball a lot. And the reason I did that was because when you're in graduate school, you're in your head all the time, right? And it's so I started playing ball, and I thought I was pretty cool, so I started playing not just ball, but street ball, heading to the asphalt court, right? In '81, I was living in Northampton, Massachusetts. I got asked by some friends to be a marshal at the Gay Pride Parade. It was the second year that the parade was happening in Northampton, Massachusetts. I'm straight. There'd been some incidents the first year, and I was asked to be a marshal for that year. So I said yes, and I marched with the parade, marched kind of in front of the parade, trying to look tough. As I was marching, there was this whole group of guys I played basketball with, and they were looking at me, right? So I want you to remember, this is 1981. It's a much more homophobic era, right? Sports, right? One of the more homophobic spaces you can be in, right? Things are changing, right? So the next Monday, it was a weekend parade, I returned to the court in late afternoon, and came up to me, some guys, and said, "Well, are ya?" Right? And I said, "What difference would it make?" And for the next year, I played ball as a gay ball player. Right? Everybody thought I was gay on the court. Until at the end of the year, I was doing a banking transaction with my wife. Apparently, she must have transfer me some money because I had a big smile on my face. I gave her a big kiss, and as I turned around, a ball player ran up to me and hugged me and said, "You're straight, you're straight." It was very reassuring for him. But for a year, I played ball as a gay ball player. For a year, they had to act and understand that a gay person could be on that court. For a year, they had to challenge their own homophobia, and me, mine. For a year, they had to remind themselves that the other could be in the room. As you do this work, you always want to make sure that your table and setting is as diverse as possible. But you might not get there, right? It might be that your group is initially mostly white, or maybe it's white and black and you haven't got the Asian experience or the Latino experience. Are you going to be the person who reminds us that when we speak about immigrants, we speak about them as though they're in the room, not by calling them rapists and calling for a wall, but acting as though the dignity of every individual human being and their thriving to contribute and be part of society is to be respected. If you're the Latino in a room with a bunch of other folks doing immigrant rights, are you the person who's insisting on the point that Nat and I were making about the need to strengthen Black organizing infrastructure, because without it, we don't have a social justice infrastructure in the United States? If you're in a room with a bunch of folks who are quite elite and quite wealthy, are you reminding folks of the thriving and hard work of those at the bottom of the income distribution whose dreams are just as big, whose energies are just as much as anybody who's made it into the professional middle class? Are you acting as though the other is in the room? Thank you.
From all of us at the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, we thank you for watching our series, Putting Racism on the Table. We hope that you will use the discussion guide that follows at the end of this video, or that you'll go to our website, www.washingtongrantmakers.org, for more information. I'm really pleased that we are putting racism on the table.